Abusive relationships are bad, so it's easy to ask yourself, why do these people stay together? Well, the answer is good games. Or at least that's the answer if you're a fan of Nintendo. In fact, there are a lot of examples of Nintendo trying to keep their customers hostage. Let's start with a really weird and embarrassing example. 3D All-Stars. In 2020, Nintendo released a compilation of 3 classic Mario games. This was a great idea, so why did people hate it? Nintendo announced that the game would only be available for half a year, even on Nintendo's own internet eShop. This was really weird because it put a completely artificial deadline on people to buy the game. Then once the game came out, it turned out there was a massive underprinting of physical copies, which led to a huge cancellation of physical pre-orders. So far, Nintendo is doing a great job of botching a foolproof game release. But then people get home with the game and start playing it, and realize it only contains half of the Super Mario Galaxy series. Now, Mario Galaxy 2 was never promised to be part of the collection, but after players had their fill of Mario Galaxy 1, they had a hankering, man. They had a real fever. So it's weird that even now, over a year later, they still haven't released Mario Galaxy 2 even for the eShop. Even more annoying is that the original All-Stars released all the way back in 1993 had 4 games instead of 3D All-Stars 3. It's weird, right? Nintendo had a guaranteed ace in the hole and they managed to just destroy it. But that's basically the theme that you're gonna start spotting with today's stories. Here's the really weird thing though. Despite all this, 3D All-Stars is one of the top-selling games of 2020. It sold 9 million copies. So why? Why did Nintendo need to bother their customers like this? Well, of course, there's a very good reason. But before I can tell you, it's time for a vibe check. Are you based and gnome-pilled? If so, welcome. Consider clicking the funny buttons under this video, as it will make me, Nisse, very happy. However, if you are cringe and goblin-pilled, just dislike and leave a mean comment. Now, your answer. Underprinting. There's an episode of South Park where Cartman buys a theme land. Cartman begins by closing the theme park down so he can enjoy all the rides for himself. But after realizing he needs to make money to maintain the park, he starts to gradually open it up again. This leads to a frenzy in the public where suddenly everyone wants to visit the theme park, simply because they couldn't before. This is a real psychological thing of exclusivity. It's the same reason why many luxury items are becoming limited edition, like how it's been with hypercars and luxury watches for a very long time. Basically, these super luxuries are exclusive not because you couldn't afford them, but because they won't sell it to you. And dear viewer, before you say that this would never work on you, have you ever bought a limited edition piece of merch from an influencer? Come on, answer honestly. But Nisse, why would this be a problem? Because, my darling, you know what happens when there's not enough hardware to go around. Nintendo scalping. Because Nintendo stuff often comes in short supply, scalpers swoop in to buy it up, so they can then resell it at a premium. This has happened multiple times, like with the Hyrule Historia, the NES Classic, several Amiibo figurines, and of course, the Nintendo Switch. If you didn't have connections inside the video games industry and couldn't secure a Switch for yourself on launch day, then because of Nintendo underprinting, you probably couldn't secure one for yourself even in the next following year. If you didn't want to pay twice as much for a scalped one, of course. What made the launch of the Switch even worse was that the hardware had a lot of issues. Extremely loud screeching that you couldn't turn off, serious corruption of game files, game data, and also the screen for some reason. The controllers could somehow be inserted upside down, which would then lock in place, and some people broke their nails trying to get it back out again. But of course, the Joy-Cons are also infamous for their build quality, with most Joy-Cons eventually experiencing such bad drift that you basically have to throw it out. Nintendo has generously offered to repair these issues even well outside of warranty, but for some reason, even the new Switches that are made now still haven't fixed this issue. But all of these hardware issues have not been the thing to take the cake when it comes to angering the customer, because that honor goes to Switch Online. Do you want to play over the internet on your new Switch? Then you'll need Nintendo's online subscription service that charges you $4 a month to play on servers that used to be free. I mean, literally, the same servers that still run as poorly as they did on the Wii U. Nintendo, here's a tip. If you're going to charge people a premium, you should give them a premium service. Fortunately, however, a lot of people haven't noticed how bad the Nintendo servers are. Why? Because they're being distracted by something even worse. Nintendo netcode. Nintendo games are infamous for terrible netcode. After paying your $4 a month, even if you have a great internet connection, you can still expect bad ping and to randomly get booted off the server. But of course, even if you have a good day where everything does work, you'll still experience Nintendo online services. All these examples make it obvious that Nintendo just doesn't understand the internet. And if you weren't convinced just yet, there's a couple more examples to whet your appetite. If you want to voice chat over one of your Nintendo online games, you can't just plug in a headset. You have to download a separate mobile phone application. This is already pretty embarrassing. But then it gets a little bit more painful when you remember that the original Xbox had onboard voice functionality in 2002. Oh, what's that? You want to add a friend on your Switch so you can play games with them? Then I hope you have their 12-digit friend code. Because even though something like MySpace figured out how to do this in 2003, you'll have to forgive Nintendo for not yet figuring out the science fiction of a search bar. And oh, you would like to find a particular custom map on a game like Mario Maker? Well, it's not like we could figure out something as simple as a server browser, which has been around since at least the inception of Half-Life. Oh, I'm sorry, am I sounding bitter to you? It's just that I was made to pay $4 a month for this shit. The 3DS. The 3DS launch was a massive disaster. A console that already existed got a new gimmick attached to it, whereupon it got booted out the door with 0 launch titles worth their salt. The 3DS launch was so bad that the current CEO of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, cut his own pay in half to apologize. With this, Nintendo had decided to make this up to the customers, which is of course where this tale turns even worse. Starting with cutting the price of the 3DS from $250 to only $170. This was a good idea. However, there was a problem with this. This price cut happened 5 months after the initial launch, which means that everybody who had bought the 3DS on launch, including me, Nisse, had paid an $80 premium. This made some people pretty mad, but Nintendo was resolved upon fixing this by making the situation yet worse. The Ambassador Program, which was created to give early adopters of the 3DS some more value for those $80. So, if you logged onto the Nintendo eShop before August the 12th, because of course it had a deadline, and you downloaded your personal Ambassador certificate, you got the privilege to download 10 steaming hot NES titles from the 1980s. Okay. And a couple months later, in December, 10 more games were made available, which were all Game Boy Advance games. You couldn't have given us some fucking DS titles, maybe? At least some of the Game Boy Advance titles are actually fun and good games. Unlike the bottom-of-the-barrel fucking scraping we got with the NES titles. Like with Mario 1 instead of Mario 3. Ice Climbers and NES Open Tournament Golf. But personally, I don't feel like this was $80 worth of value. What do you think? Do you think they should have at least included one fucking Pokemon game in there, maybe? Ultimately, though, the 3DS floundered because it just didn't have a good library. I mean, just compare the 3DS library to the regular DS library. Like, there was no reason to get a 3DS. And it would seem that this became a trend, with the very next piece of Nintendo hardware that came out the very next year. The Wii U. The Wii U was the same thing as with the 3DS. Take the current console, slap an unnecessary piece of gimmick on there, and then boot it out the door without any good titles. I mean, sure, it's got Donkey Kong, it's got a couple of good Nintendo titles, but again, compared to the Wii, I mean, really, competing with the DS and the Wii is super hard. These are two of the best consoles of all time. Consoles that were so good that they even turned the most pessimistic of the hardcore into eventual fans. Name another console with real honest-to-God arcade-style rail shooters. Time's up. That's what I thought. But at least the idea of the gamepad eventually turned into the Switch, so I do congratulate them on experimenting. The Mario Party Glove. It's obvious to anybody that the N64 controller has one of the worst layouts of all time. But what if I told you that it can actually physically injure you? Mario Party 1 from all the way back in 1998 had a lot of minigames where you had to rotate the control pad. Because of the lack of rubber on the control stick, this caused over 100 children to hurt themselves while they were rotating the control stick. And rotating the control stick. This would mostly include blistering, but there were also examples of the skin actually being worn down to the point of splitting open. Because of this, a number of moms got together and sued Nintendo. But even funnier, they actually won, and scored a settlement of $75,000. But just the money wasn't good enough. Nintendo was also forced to supply a glove to everybody who wanted one. These original gloves have actually become a bit of a collector's item, because very few players actually applied to get the glove. I guess they just preferred the experience raw. So if you have an original copy of Mario Party and a glove that goes with it, it's now actually worth money to collectors because it's a funny story, and definitely not because they want to sniff the glove for some illicit thrill. Now, speaking of the N64, this was actually an extremely bad time for Nintendo, starting with the Nintendo 64 disk drive, which was an expansion for the original N64. Now, if you haven't heard about this, you're not the only one. This piece of Nintendo hardware history has been kept rather secret because it was a gargantuan flop. The disk drive was actually announced before the N64 was released. The DD was intended to power up the N64 to make up for some of its weaknesses, mainly that the N64 was still using cartridges like its predecessor, the SNES, which, even though they read so fast that games on them basically didn't have any load screens, could only hold 1/10 of the data that a CD could. If you heard about the 5th generation of consoles before, you probably already know that the PlayStation officially won this generation by providing long titles like Final Fantasy VII that gave great value. So Nintendo was aware of this, but because the disk drive really couldn't solve any of these problems, it kept getting delayed year after year year after year, in big part because previous expansion consoles like the Sega Genesis did not get very well received by customers. But since Nintendo had promised to release it, the DD came out in December of 1999, although only for the Japanese market. It came with mostly creative titles such as Mario Paint 2, and it even had internet functionality. But because you had to subscribe to a paid service to access the internet, where have we heard this before? It never really had a chance to take off. Only 15,000 units of the disc drive was ever sold, which is absolutely nothing in comparison to the 32 million Nintendo 64 sold. Developers working on games for the DD wisely shifted their priorities to the coming Nintendo GameCube. More on this lost gaming history in the Resident Evil tier list. And as the GameCube arrived 2 years later in 2001, the disc drive was quietly discontinued. But unlike the Mario Party Glove, the DD is not quite a collector's item because nobody cares. But my darling, this is just the start of the catastrophe that is the 5th generation of consoles for Nintendo. Nintendo created 4 major controversies during this time, and one of them is now one of their main rivals. Let's move into number 2 with the Philips CDI. Once upon a time, Nintendo wanted to create a CD reader for their SNES console. To do so, they enlisted the help of Philips, a Dutch corporation with lots of experience in creating electronics. This project went absolutely nowhere, but as the project was shut down, Philips emerged, still holding the rights to create games based on Nintendo's IP. And yes, you may know where this is going. 4 of the worst games ever created using the Zelda and Mario franchise, all released for the Philips CDI, Philips' own console. Hotel Mario, Zelda the Wand of Gamelon, Link the Faces of Evil, and Zelda's Adventure. These games are so bad they actually deserve their own video to explain everything wrong with them. But to make a long story short, they were so bad that they're actually art. And most interestingly, these games are the most noteworthy thing about the CDI, which is weirdly beautiful in some way. But Nintendo would not give up so easily, so Nintendo set out again to find another corporation they could make a CD reading console with. And this brings us to something you may not have heard about: the Nintendo PlayStation. Yes, really, the corporation Nintendo found was Sony. Now, consider liking, subscribing, and ring the bell. And click here for part 2. Talk to me, Nisse, over Discord. Follow me on Twitter for updates, and join Grocery Gang through Patreon if you want to help me not hemorrhage money while making these videos. Speaking of which, Forge, Awan, Harry, Nathan, Pumba, Omger, Egg, and everyone else on the Patreon, thank you for watching. But Nisse, wasn't this supposed to be every Nintendo controversy? Kronk, fetch the laser gun.